Some stories sound impossible until you look at the evidence. This is Final Statement. In the summer of 2008, the air in Orlando was heavy with heat, but the house on Hope Spring Drive held a different kind of stillness. 2-year-old Caylee Anthony had been the center of that home. She was a child who moved with constant energy, her presence marked by the sound of toys hitting the floor and the steady rhythm of a small voice humming to herself. She loved to dance in the living room, spinning until she lost her balance and landed in a heap of giggles. But then, the movement stopped. On the 16th of June 2008, a car pulled out of the driveway. Caylee Anthony and her daughter were inside. They drove away, and the house grew quiet. It was the last time anyone would see the child. The sun continued to rise over the suburb, the neighbors continued their routines, and the local news cycles moved on. But inside that home, the space where a child had existed began to hollow out. Nobody realized it yet, but the life that had been so vibrant was already gone, replaced by a silence that would soon demand answers from a nation. For 31 days, the world continued as if nothing had changed. The mail arrived, the sprinklers cycled, and the neighbors waved to the front porch. Inside the home, George and Cindy went about their days, assuming their granddaughter was safe. They believed she was with a nanny, a woman they had never met but who Caylee insisted was watching over the girl. Meanwhile, the calendar pages turned. 1 week became 2, 2 became 3. The silence in the hallway where a child once played remained unbroken, yet no alarm was raised. No one called the police. No one demanded to see the girl. It was a month of impossible normalcy built on a foundation of omission. 31 days of missed opportunities, of questions never asked, and of a reality that remained hidden in plain sight. Then, the clock ran out. The illusion of a routine existence began to crack under the weight of the missing time. The clock did not stop, but the truth behind those silent weeks was about to tear the quiet suburban life apart. Every morning during that month, the sun rose on an empty room, and every evening the family locked the doors, completely unaware that they were living in the shadow of a tragedy that had already occurred. While the house remained quiet, Caylee moved with a new, frantic energy. She did not look for her daughter. She did not call her parents to check on the girl. Instead, she stepped into a different world entirely. Her nights were spent in crowded nightclubs, where the music was loud enough to drown out any lingering questions. She moved between dance floors, drinks in hand, laughing with strangers who had no idea what was missing. Days were spent drifting, avoiding the home where her parents expected to see a child. Then came the afternoon she walked into a shop and sat down for a needle. She watched as ink bit into her skin, spelling out the words "beautiful life." She walked out with the mark fresh and raw, a permanent testament to her state of mind during those 31 days. She was not a mother in mourning. She was someone shedding a skin. She filled the void left by her daughter with noise, strobe lights, and social connections. Every photograph captured her smiling, oblivious to the clock ticking down at home. The disconnect was absolute. The public would later look at these images and see a monster, but in those moments, she was simply a woman running as hard and as fast as she could from the truth. The car had been sitting in the impound lot for days, baking in the July heat. When Cindy finally gained access to the vehicle, she approached the trunk with a singular purpose. She needed to retrieve belongings, but the moment the latch clicked and the seal broke, she recoiled. A smell hit her heavy, cloying and impossible to ignore. It was the scent of decay. She stood back, the air around the car thick and stagnant. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone. The 911 dispatcher answered, and Cindy's voice cracked as she began the call. She did not mince words. She told the operator that the car smelled like a dead body. She repeated it, her tone shifting from disbelief to a frantic, dawning horror. The call lasted minutes, but it dismantled the last remnants of the family's fragile delusion. Outside the car, the world shifted. The police were dispatched, sirens began their approach, and the quiet suburban street transformed into a scene of active investigation. The smell had spoken what no one wanted to admit. The secret was no longer contained within the household. It was now a matter of public record, and the forensic nightmare had officially begun. When the officers arrived, Caylee stood ready with a rehearsed script. She gestured toward the horizon, naming a nanny who supposedly held the child. She insisted the woman lived in a specific apartment complex. The police moved quickly, sirens leading the way to the address she provided. They arrived at the door, expecting to find a witness or a lead. Instead, they found a vacant unit. The apartment had been empty for months. No nanny, no child, no trace of the life Caylee had described. The officers turned back to her. She shifted her story, pivoting to her employment. She claimed to hold a position at Universal Studios, a job that would explain her long absences. The investigators checked the records. They found nothing. She had been fired long ago. Each lie she offered was met with a cold, factual rejection from the evidence gathered at the scene. Her composure began to fray as the walls of her own making closed in. She was no longer a daughter explaining a situation to her parents. She was a suspect cornered by her own fabrications. Every word she spoke was now being logged, cross-referenced, and discarded. The web was not just breaking. It was unraveling entirely, leaving her with no ground to stand on. The focus shifted from the spoken word to the cold, undeniable trail of data. Inside the family home, investigators powered up the computer that had been a silent witness to the weeks of deception. They combed through browser histories, logs, and stored files. The screen flickers as they highlighted a search query that stopped the room's movement. Someone had searched for the word chloroform. Then, they found it again, and again. The pattern was deliberate, clinical, and chilling. Each entry was a time-stamped piece of a plan that had nothing to do with a missing child and everything to do with a calculated end. Simultaneously, the forensic team processed the vehicle that had sat in the impound lot. They deployed specialized equipment to sample the fibers and the air trapped in the trunk lining. The results returned with blunt finality. Traces of human decomposition were present. Science did not care about stories or alibis. It provided a stark, physical reality that transformed the investigation. The suspicion of child neglect evaporated, replaced by the heavy, suffocating gravity of a murder inquiry. The investigators looked at the digital data and the forensic reports, realizing they were no longer searching for a child who might be found. They were gathering the pieces of a crime that had already reached its conclusion. The search moved from the digital world back to the physical landscape surrounding the Anthony home. It was December, and the woods were stripped of their summer cover, leaving the ground exposed and unforgiving. A utility worker moved through the brush, his boots sinking into the damp, decaying leaves. He stopped. A few yards away, partially obscured by overgrowth, something looked out of place. It was not the usual discarded trash or weathered debris common to these outskirts. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he made out the distinct shape of a laundry bag. It sat in the shadow of a fallen limb, half buried in the mud. The air seemed to thin. The worker stood still, the silence of the winter forest pressing against him. He did not touch it. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his fingers moving with a sudden, rigid precision. He knew he had found something that would change the trajectory of the entire search. The atmosphere shifted in an instant. The uncertainty that had defined the previous months began to crystallize into a singular, suffocating realization. The search was coming to a close, but the outcome was not the one anyone had prayed for. The woods held their secret, and now, that secret was being pulled into the light. The woods swarmed with activity. Yellow tape sliced through the trees, marking a perimeter around the laundry bag. Forensic technicians moved with calculated, quiet efficiency, kneeling in the dirt to document the site before disturbing a single leaf. They opened the bag. The reality of the find was immediate and absolute. Among the remains lay a piece of duct tape, positioned near the skull. It was not discarded debris. It was a deliberate, brutal component of a final act. The investigators recorded the placement, their movements slowing as the implications became undeniable. Back at the laboratory, the process of identification was a race against the weight of the evidence. Dental records were pulled and cross-referenced with the skeletal structure. The match came through with chilling, cold precision. It was Caylee. The news traveled through the department like a shockwave. The investigative focus hardened instantly, discarding any remaining theories of accidents or kidnappings. With the cause of death linked to the physical evidence at the scene, the state moved to escalate the case. The charges were drafted, signed, and filed. Caylee Anthony was now facing a capital murder charge. The state was no longer looking for a missing child. They were preparing to prosecute a mother for the death of her daughter. The courtroom in 2011 became the focal point of the world. Heavy doors swung shut, sealing the jury and the gallery inside. The atmosphere was tight, defined by the weight of the evidence presented by the prosecution. They stood before the jury and laid out a singular, chilling narrative. They argued that the motivation was a desire to escape the responsibilities of motherhood. To prove this, they pointed to the data on the family computer. They detailed the specific, repeated searches for chloroform. They brought the physical evidence into the room, describing the chemical traces of decomposition found in the trunk of the car. Every word spoken by the prosecution acted as a stone in a wall they were building around the defendant. The courtroom benches were packed. Cameras and reporters filled the halls, turning the proceedings into a global obsession. The jury sat in a row, watching every movement, absorbing the testimony as it unfolded. The evidence was presented with clinical coldness, stripping away the mystery of the previous months. There was no room for ambiguity in the opening statements. The prosecutors drew a direct line from the search history to the scene in the woods. The trial had begun, and the intensity of the testimony left no room for doubt about the stakes. The defense rose, and the room grew unnaturally still. They did not contest the death itself. They dismantled the cause. They stood before the jury and presented a narrative that fundamentally altered the trial. They claimed Caylee had not been murdered, but had died in a tragic accident. They pointed to the family swimming pool as the site of a drowning. The defense then dropped the accusation that shattered the courtroom's composure. They stated that George Anthony had discovered the body and, in a state of panic, had assisted in hiding it to prevent a public scandal. The gallery erupted in quiet, frantic whispers. The prosecution's timeline of calculated murder was suddenly replaced by a story of secrecy and family complicity. The defense argued this was not a death born of malice, but a cover-up born of fear. Every juror turned their attention toward the defense table, processing the claim that the grandfather had been the primary agent in the concealment of the remains. The air in the room grew heavy with the weight of this new allegation. It was a pivot point that transformed a straightforward case into a complex, dark mystery, leaving those in the courtroom to grapple with a completely different set of facts. George Anthony walked to the witness stand under the gaze of the entire courtroom. He sat down, adjusted his posture, and prepared to confront the accusation that he had helped hide his own granddaughter. The defense attorney began the cross-examination, pressing him on the timeline of the drowning and his alleged knowledge of the body. George gripped the wooden railing of the stand until his knuckles turned white. His breathing became audible, sharp, and uneven. He denied every allegation, his voice cracking as he repeated his refusal to accept the version of events the defense proposed. The tension in the room spiked. He looked toward the gallery, then toward the defense table, his eyes wet. He began to weep. The sound of his sobbing cut through the silence of the court. He wiped his face with a tissue, his shoulders shaking with the effort of holding his composure. He maintained his denial through the tears, insisting he had no part in the concealment of the remains. His distress was raw and visible, forcing the jury to watch a man visibly unravel under the pressure of the accusation. The courtroom remained frozen, observing the collapse of a grandfather caught between the gravity of the trial and the weight of his own family history. The final arguments concluded, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy and suffocating. Prosecutors had laid out over 400 pieces of evidence, a mountain of data meant to secure a conviction. The jury gathered their notes, stood, and filed out of the courtroom. The expectation was for days, perhaps weeks, of intense debate. The public waited outside the courthouse, bracing for a long, drawn-out standoff. Instead, the clock began to move with startling speed. Hours passed, then a few more. The air in the city grew thin with the sudden, sharp realization that the decision was coming far faster than anyone had predicted. 10 hours. That was the window they took to weigh the life of a child and the fate of her mother. Inside the jury room, the doors remained closed, but the pressure radiated outward. Every camera lens in the city turned toward the courthouse entrance. Reporters paced the pavement, checking their watches and monitoring the silence. The world held its breath. The scale of the evidence stood in stark opposition to the brevity of the process. Somewhere behind those closed doors, the final tally was being recorded. The weight was no longer about the trial itself, but about the impending collision between the evidence and the verdict. The courtroom doors swung open. The jurors filed back in, their faces unreadable, maintaining a rigid posture that signaled the end of the wait. The judge took the bench, and the silence in the room became absolute. A clerk stood, holding the folded paper that contained the outcome of the 3-year ordeal. Every person in the gallery leaned forward, hands gripping the backs of chairs. The clerk began to read, "Not guilty of murder." The words hit the room like a physical blow. A sharp, collective intake of breath swept through the rows of observers. Not guilty of manslaughter. The sequence continued, systematically dismantling the case the prosecution had built over 33 days. Casey sat motionless, her gaze fixed ahead, showing no visible reaction to the sequence of acquittals. Across the room, the prosecution team remained still, their expressions hardening. The clerk finished, and the judge confirmed the record. The verdict was final. The weight of the moment shifted instantly. Reporters scrambled to their devices, sending the news out to a global audience that had expected a different conclusion. The room erupted into a low, chaotic murmur, a sudden release of tension that quickly curdled into audible disbelief as the reality of the acquittal set in. The legal machinery ground to a halt, leaving only the conviction for lying to police on the record. Casey left the courthouse through a side exit, shielded from the immediate glare of the cameras. Outside, the streets were packed. People stood on the sidewalks, holding signs, shouting and pressing against the metal barricades. The news reached the crowd in real time, and the volume rose until it became a single, sustained roar. Legal experts stepped before microphones, dissecting the prosecution's failure to meet the standard of reasonable doubt, but their words did little to dampen the fury on the pavement. The gap between the courtroom's conclusion and the public's perception of justice widened into a chasm. People traveled for miles just to stand at the perimeter of the building, waiting for a glimpse of the woman who had just been acquitted of the charges that defined the last 3 years. The air was thick with the sound of chanting and the sharp, rhythmic clicks of camera shutters. Reporters shouted questions that went unanswered. The city hummed with a volatile energy that felt ready to snap. It was a victory for the defense, but for the onlookers, it was a profound, stinging defeat that left the question of what truly happened to the child hanging in the air. The fury that erupted after the trial did not evaporate. It hardened into policy. Several states moved to pass what became known as Caylee's Law, creating a mandatory time frame for parents to report a missing child. It was a direct response to the silence that defined the summer of 2008. The legislation transformed the tragedy into a barrier against future neglect, ensuring that no child could vanish without a search beginning immediately. But beyond the statutes and the court records, there remains the image of the girl. Born in 2005, she occupied a world of simple joys. She gathered her favorite toys, she practiced her dance steps, and she moved through her days with a presence that left a mark on those who knew her. The legal system closed its case, but the memory of the 2-year-old remains a call to action. She was a child who loved to dance. She was a child who deserved to grow up. This has been Final Statement. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and share it. These victims deserve to be remembered.